I suppose I should have died that first night. Would have been cleaner. A bullet to the back of the skull in some administrative courtyard, my name reduced to a number scratched off a list, my body dumped into one of those furnaces that burn day and night beneath the hive's lower levels. Instead, they gave me the red stripe, painted it across my forehead like a brand while I was still shackled to the wall of the holding cell, still tasting blood from where the enforcer's shock maul had split my lip. The stroke was impersonal, efficient. The administratum clerk didn't even look at my face as she marked me, just checked her data slate, verified my conviction codes, and applied the pigment with a brush that had marked 1,000 foreheads before mine. The paint was cold. I remember that detail with strange clarity, how cold it felt against my skin, like the touch of something already dead. The red stripe meant Penal Legion. Everyone knew what that meant. Even those of us who'd spent our lives in the hive's mid-levels, never seeing daylight, never hearing anything about the wars beyond our world, except as distant abstractions. The Penal Legions were where the Imperium sent its expendable criminals, its political inconveniences, its quota fillers, when the guard regiments needed bodies. And the regular tithe came up short. They dressed it up in the language of redemption, serve the emperor in death, earn forgiveness through sacrifice, purge your sins in holy fire. But everyone understood the truth. The Penal Legions were where people went to be used up and forgotten. My crime was theft, not even interesting theft. I'd falsified cargo manifests in the warehouse where I worked, skimmed off enough to sell on the grey market to keep my family fed during a particularly brutal rationing cycle. 3 months I got away with it. 3 months of slightly fuller bellies, of my daughter's cough finally subsiding because we could afford the Medicaid paste, of sleeping without the gnawing. Certainty that we'd starve before the next distribution. Then someone noticed the discrepancies, probably another clerk, someone ambitious enough to audit the records, someone hoping to climb by stepping on my face. The enforcers came at shift change. They didn't even let me say goodbye. My wife was at the communal refectory. My daughter was at the creche. I never saw them again. That was 14 months ago, though time has become elastic and strange in the interim, stretching and compressing until I can barely recall the exact sequence of events. The processing took 6 weeks. They held us in a detention block that had been converted from an old water reclamation facility, the cells still smelling of rust and biological matter, despite the layers of whitewash on the walls. There were 200 of us, maybe more. The cells were built for 30. We slept in shifts, packed so tight that you couldn't lie down without touching 3 other bodies. The lights never went out. Bright white lumen strips that hummed with a frequency that burrowed into your skull and nested there, constant and inescapable. Some of the prisoners tried to cover their eyes with torn cloth, but the guards would tear it away during their irregular inspections. They wanted us exhausted, wanted us broken before the real breaking began. They fed us twice a day. A grey slurry dispensed from a spigot into plastic bowls, lukewarm and flavourless, textured like industrial paste because it probably was industrial paste, the same nutrient mixture they fed to servitors and assembly line workers. It kept you alive but provided no satisfaction, no pleasure. The body processed it mechanically, extracting the minimum calories necessary for function. Some of the prisoners couldn't keep it down at first, their stomachs rebelling against the chemical composition, but hunger corrected that resistance within a few days. You learned to eat without thinking, shoveling the substance into your mouth while your mind retreated somewhere else, anywhere else. The other prisoners were a catalogue of imperial failure. There were genuine criminals, of course, murderers, rapists, heretics, the kind of human wreckage that every hive city produces in abundance. But there were also people like me, a woman who'd spoken too freely about supply shortages at a sanctioned gathering, her words interpreted as criticism of the planetary governor. An old man who'd failed to meet his factory's production quota for 3 consecutive months, his arthritic hands unable to maintain the necessary pace, a boy who couldn't have been more than 16, condemned for some petty vandalism that had damaged a shrine to the emperor. His hands shook constantly, and he cried in his sleep, muffled sobs that none of us acknowledged because acknowledging them would mean confronting our own terror. The interrogations were sporadic and pointless. They already had our confessions, our convictions recorded and sealed, but the administratum operates on ritual as much as function, and so we were questioned again and again, sometimes by bored clerks who barely listened to our answers, sometimes by junior officers who seemed to be practicing their intimidation techniques. They asked the same questions in different formulations. They presented documents for us to sign, thick sheaves of parchment covered in high Gothic legalese that none of us could read. We signed. What else could we do? Refusal meant immediate execution. Compliance meant delaying the inevitable. So we signed, marking our names or making our thumbprints, legally consenting to our own destruction. On the 43rd day, they shaved us, stripped us naked in groups of 20, and ran us through a decontamination chamber that sprayed us with chemical solution so caustic it left our skin red and burning. Then they shaved every hair from our bodies, heads, faces, arms, legs, everywhere. The razors were old and dull. The orderlies who wielded them were efficient but not gentle. Blood mixed with the chemicals and ran in pink streams toward the drains. Afterward, they issued us our uniforms. Grey jumpsuits made of coarse synthetic fiber that chafed against the skin, particularly in the places where the razors had scraped too close. Black boots with soft soles, sized generically so that almost no one had a proper fit. A canvas bag for personal effects, though by this point we had no personal effects to carry. The red stripe on my forehead had faded during the processing, the pigment washing away gradually under the harsh cleaning protocols. They repainted it the morning we shipped out. This time it was done with something permanent, a tattoo machine that buzzed like an angry insect as it drove ink beneath the skin. The pain was sharp and clean, almost clarifying after weeks of ambient misery. The stripe was wider now, more prominent, covering the space between my eyebrows and extending up toward my hairline, a permanent mark of shame and disposability. I caught my reflection in a polished metal panel as we filed toward the transport bay. I barely recognized myself. The shaved head, the gaunt face, the dead eyes. I looked like every other prisoner, every other condemned soul shuffling toward the waiting ships. The transport was a bulk hauler, designed for cargo rather than human passengers, refitted with crude harnesses and restraint systems. They packed us in like livestock, mag-locking our boots to the deck plates in neat rows, 50 to a bay. The harnesses were old Imperial Guard surplus, the straps cracked and stiff. The woman locked in beside me had a port wine birthmark covering half her face. She'd been convicted of sedition, she told me in a whisper, for keeping a diary that contained treasonous observations about resource distribution inequities. She'd been a teacher. She spoke with the careful grammar of the educated, but her eyes had the same emptiness I'd seen in every mirror and polished surface since the enforcers took me. We were already becoming ghosts, our former selves evaporating in the harsh light of imperial justice. The ship lifted with a lurch that made my stomach drop. Artificial gravity fluctuated during ascent, making us sway in our harnesses like kelp in an ocean current. Several prisoners vomited, unable to control their bodies' rebellion. The smell filled the bay quickly, acrid, biological, human. The environmental systems whined and struggled, unable to fully recycle the air. We would live with that smell for the entire journey, breathing it into our lungs, absorbing it into our skin until we became indistinguishable from the stink of our own degradation. The voyage lasted 6 weeks, though I only know this because someone kept count by scratching marks into the deck plate with a loose screw. Without viewports, without natural light, without any reference to external reality, time became theoretical. They fed us once per ship cycle, the same grey slurry dispensed from tubes that descended from the ceiling. They let us out of the harnesses for 1 hour per cycle to use the waste reclamation stations, a row of holes in the floor with no privacy, no dignity, just the animal necessity of elimination performed in full view of dozens of others. Some prisoners couldn't do it at first, their shame overriding their physical needs, but the body has its own logic, and eventually even the most modest among us learned to squat over those holes and do what needed to be done. The woman with the birthmark died 3 weeks into the voyage. One cycle she was there, whispering stories about her students, about the books she'd read, about the small rebellions, of keeping your mind alive in a system designed to crush thought. The next cycle her harness was empty, her body already removed and processed. I never learned her name, never thought to ask. That seems important now, a failure of basic humanity that I can't undo. She existed, and then she didn't, and the only evidence of her passage was a faint smell of ozone where the servitors had sterilized her harness for the next occupant. Others died too. Disease spread through the cramped quarters despite the chemical baths and antibacterial protocols. A coughing sickness that started with a tickle in the throat and progressed to bloody sputum and gasping struggles for breath. The ship's Medicae servitors would remove the worst cases, dragging them away to some quarantine section we never saw. Whether they recovered or were simply disposed of, we never knew. Probably the latter. Simpler that way, more efficient. The administratum doesn't waste resources on the condemned. I got sick too, not the coughing sickness, but a fever that came in waves, making my skin burn and my thoughts fragment into disconnected images. For 3 cycles I existed in a delirium, where the present and past merged and separated, where I saw my daughter's face in the corroded metal of the ceiling, where I heard my wife's voice in the ambient hum of the ship's systems. The man locked beside me, a former gang enforcer with crude tattoos covering his arms, kept me from aspirating my own vomit during the worst of it. I never thanked him, never got the chance. He died 2 days after my fever broke, his harness empty when I returned from the waste stations, another anonymous casualty processed and forgotten. They let us out of the harnesses more frequently during the final week of transit. Calisthenics, they called it, though it was really just making sure we could still walk, still move, still perform basic physical functions. We weren't valuable, but we were also not entirely worthless. The Emperor's wars consumed bodies at a prodigious rate, and even the condemned had utility as meat to throw at enemy positions, as expendable scouts, as human triggers for mines and traps. So they made us exercise in the cramped bay, running in place, doing squats and push-ups, movements that kept our muscles from complete atrophy. The guards, regular Imperial Navy armsmen, not prisoners, watched with expressions of clinical detachment. We were cargo. They were handlers. The relationship was purely functional. The ship docked without ceremony. One moment we were in transit, the next the deck lurched, and the magnetic seals engaged with a resounding clang that echoed through the bulkheads. The armsmen unshackled us from our harnesses and herded us toward the exit ramp. The gravity here was heavier than what I'd grown up with, making each step feel leaden and exhausting. My legs trembled after weeks of minimal use, threatening to buckle. Around me other prisoners staggered and swayed, some fell. The armsmen didn't help them up, just kept us moving, a river of grey jumpsuits flowing down the ramp and into whatever fresh hell awaited. The world they'd brought us to was called Tertius-17. I learned this from the painted signs in the landing zone, high Gothic letters 3 meters tall declaring ownership and jurisdiction. It was an industrial world, the sky a perpetual grey-brown haze that smelled of smoke and chemicals. The landing zone was a vast permacrete expanse, cratered and stained, surrounded by manufacturing complexes that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The noise was overwhelming after weeks of shipboard monotony. The roar of furnaces, the screech of metal on metal, the rumble of heavy vehicles, the distant thunder of artillery fire. This was a war zone, I realized with sick clarity. The factories were still running, but somewhere beyond the visible horizon, people were dying in bulk. They marched us through the landing zone to a processing facility that resembled a slaughterhouse more than a military installation. Long concrete buildings with narrow windows, surrounded by razor wire and watchtowers. The gates were operated by servitors, their dead eyes tracking our passage with the dispassion of machines. Inside, the fluorescent lighting was harsh and flickering, creating a strobing effect that made everything seem unreal, like a badly edited recording. We stood in lines for hours, while tech priests and Medicae servitors examined us with instruments that probed and measured, determining our fitness for combat. Those who failed the assessment were led away through a separate door. We heard a single muffled report from beyond that door, then silence. The message was clear: pass or die. There was no third option. I passed. My body somehow was still functional enough to meet the minimum standards. The servitor examining me logged something on its data slate and moved on to the next prisoner without comment. We were issued weapons that afternoon. Lasguns so old, their power packs were held in place with wire and prayers, the casings scratched and dented from decades of use. They showed us how to load them, how to fire them, how to clear basic malfunctions. The instruction lasted 3 hours. At the end, a commissar, the first I'd seen, resplendent in his black coat and peaked cap, informed us that we were now soldiers of the Emperor, that we would serve until death or victory, that cowardice would be met with immediate execution. He shot one of the prisoners who'd been whispering to his neighbor during the speech. The last bolt took the man in the chest, dropping him instantly. We dragged the body outside ourselves at the commissar's order. No one whispered after that. The Penal Legion camp was a sprawl of prefab structures and mud, surrounded by more razor wire and watchtowers manned by regular guard troops. Our quarters were long barracks buildings, each housing 200 prisoners. No, soldiers. We were soldiers now, that's what they kept telling us. In bunks stacked 4 high. The bunks were metal frames with thin mattresses that smelled of mold and previous occupants. We were assigned spaces based on arrival time. I got an upper bunk near the latrine end of the building, where the smell was worst, but at least I didn't have to stumble far in the dark when my bladder woke me. The man in the bunk below me was missing 3 fingers on his left hand, the stumps old and poorly healed. He'd been a Medicaid orderly, he said, convicted of stealing pharmaceuticals. He'd been selling them, he admitted, but also using some to treat people who couldn't afford the official rates. He seemed to think this was important, this distinction between pure greed and complicated necessity. I didn't tell him it made no difference. We were both here. The reasons didn't matter anymore. Training began the next morning at 0400 hours. They woke us with sirens that sounded like dying animals, a wailing pitch that went on for 5 minutes while we scrambled from our bunks and assembled in formation outside the barracks. The mud was ankle-deep and freezing. We stood in ranks while sergeants, regular guard, not Penal Legion, screamed at us about discipline and formation and the Emperor's expectations. Then we ran, kilometers of running in our ill-fitting boots, through the mud and smoke, around the perimeter of the camp and through obstacle courses designed to exhaust and humble. People fell, some got up, some didn't. The commissars shot those who stayed down too long, their bodies left in the mud as reminders and warnings. The training was brutal but not particularly sophisticated. They taught us to march in formation, to follow basic commands, to maintain our weapons in the field. They taught us to dig foxholes in the poisoned earth, to string razor wire, to identify enemy positions by sound and movement. They taught us that our lives were currency, to be spent according to imperial calculus, that our only value lay in our willingness to die in service of objectives we would never understand. The instruction was delivered with casual cruelty, punctuated by beatings for those who were slow to learn or clumsy in execution. The sergeants carried shock mauls and used them liberally. The commissars carried bolt pistols and used them selectively, choosing their targets to maximize terror and compliance. At night, lying in my bunk and listening to the sounds of 200 men breathing, weeping, praying, I would think about my daughter. I'd try to remember her face, but the details kept slipping away, replaced by generic features that could have belonged to any child. I'd try to remember my wife's voice, but all I heard was the screaming of the sergeants, the crack of the commissar's pistols. My past was dissolving, eaten away by the present's grinding horror. I was becoming what they wanted me to become, an empty vessel, a tool, a body to throw at the enemy's guns. The indoctrination sessions were worse than the physical training. They gathered us in a large hall every 3rd day and subjected us to hours of propaganda. A tech priest would operate a projection array that displayed images of imperial glory, space marines in heroic poses, saints in positions of suffering and transcendence, the god emperor himself in 1,000 different artistic interpretations. A priest of the ecclesiarchy would preach about redemption through service, about how our crimes had separated us from the Emperor's light, about how only death in his name could restore our souls. The rhetoric was circular and hypnotic, the same phrases repeated until they lost meaning and became pure sound, pure psychological conditioning. We were required to recite prayers in unison. We were required to demonstrate our faith through self-flagellation, striking ourselves with small whips until our backs were cross-hatched with welts. Those who showed insufficient enthusiasm were marked for additional instruction, which meant isolation in a cell with the propaganda on constant loop for 72 hours, no food, no sleep, just the voice of the priest and the images of imperial righteousness. I broke during the 4th indoctrination session. Or perhaps I didn't break so much as finally understand that resistance was pointless. The words coming from my mouth, the prayers, the declarations of faith, the promises of loyalty, meant nothing. They were sounds my mouth made to ensure my body's survival. Inside, I was already dead. The person I'd been, the man who'd had a wife and a daughter and a job and a life, however small and circumscribed, was gone. What remained was a thing that could march and shoot and follow orders. That was all. That was enough. Expecting more was a category error, a failure to understand the fundamental nature of imperial governance. The food in the camp was marginally better than the ship's slurry, though that was damning with faint praise. We received rations twice daily, compressed protein bars and vitamin supplements, occasionally supplemented with something that might charitably be called stew, though it was mostly water and vegetable matter too degraded to identify. The water came from purification tanks that never quite removed the chemical taste, a metallic bitterness that coated your tongue and lingered. We ate quickly, mechanically, not because we were hungry, but because scheduled time for eating was limited, and failure to consume your rations was considered wasteful, and waste in the Imperium was a sin worthy of punishment. 3 weeks into training, they took us to observe an execution, a regular event apparently designed to reinforce discipline. The condemned were 10 prisoners, soldiers from another Penal Legion unit, accused of planning desertion. The evidence was likely fabricated or at best circumstantial, but evidence was beside the point. The executions were theater, a demonstration of power and consequence. They made us stand in formation in a large courtyard, while the condemned were marched out and forced to kneel in a line. The commissar who'd addressed us that first day read the charges in a flat, bureaucratic tone. Then he walked down the line and shot each man in the back of the head. The last bolts made wet sounds on impact. The bodies slumped in sequence like a collapsing wave. We were ordered to march past the corpses afterward, to look at them, to understand that this was our fate if we strayed from absolute obedience. The faces were unrecognizable, the last bolts having done catastrophic damage at such close range, but I found myself searching for individual features anyway, trying to see who these men had been. I found nothing. They were meat. We were meat. The distinction between the living and the dead was provisional, a matter of timing rather than essence. Disease ran through the camp constantly. Respiratory infections, skin conditions, parasitic infestations. The conditions were perfect for pathogens, and our immune systems were suppressed by malnutrition and stress. The Medicae station was staffed by a single apothecary servitor and a junior Medicae officer who seemed perpetually exhausted. They dispensed antibiotics sparingly, prioritizing cases that might respond to treatment. The rest were left to recover or die as their bodies dictated. I developed an infected blister on my heel that swelled and burst, leaving a suppurating wound that refused to heal. The Medicae officer glanced at it, injected me with something that burned like acid, and sent me back to training. I limped for 2 weeks before the infection finally subsided, leaving a puckered scar that still aches when the atmospheric pressure drops. We learned to steal. The official rations weren't enough to sustain human function under the training regimen, so we supplemented through unofficial means. Food stores were heavily guarded, but the supply chains were long and complex, and there were always spillages, discrepancies, opportunities for those desperate or clever enough to exploit them. I never became proficient at it. My previous life had been too ordered, too rule-bound, and I couldn't fully adapt to the camp's shadow economy. But I learned enough to survive. A stolen protein bar here, an extra canteen of water there, small thefts that accumulated into the margin between death and continued existence. Others were more aggressive. The man who slept 3 bunks down had been a gang member before his conviction, and he established a protection racket within our barracks, extorting rations from the weaker prisoners in exchange for safety from more violent predators. The sergeants knew about it and did nothing. Perhaps they approved, seeing it as a Darwinian filter that would cull the least fit before combat did. Perhaps they simply didn't care. The Penal Legions operated under different rules than regular guard units. There was less cohesion, less camaraderie, just a collection of desperate individuals bound together by threat of death and faint hope of redemption. At the 6-week mark, they declared us combat ready. This was laughable. We'd barely mastered basic weapon maintenance, our marksmanship was atrocious, and half of us were sick or injured, but apparently the front lines needed bodies more than they needed properly trained soldiers. We were issued additional equipment, flak armor so thin it might stop a knife but certainly wouldn't stop a bullet, combat webbing with pouches for ammunition and rations, a helmet with a cracked visor. We were also issued our death certificates. Actual physical documents, printed on imperial watermarked paper with our names and conviction codes and designation as Penal Legion troops. The certificates were pre-signed by a commissar, lacking only the date and cause of death. We were expected to carry them in a sealed pouch on our webbing. When we died, someone would retrieve the pouch, fill in the details, and submit the certificate to the administratum. Our deaths would be logged, tabulated, added to the vast accounting of imperial casualties. Then we would be forgotten. The transport to the front arrived on a grey morning thick with smoke. A column of trucks with open beds, painted in mud-caked camouflage, driven by servitors with blank faces. We loaded ourselves 50 to a truck, standing packed so tightly we swayed as a single mass when the vehicles lurched into motion. The camp disappeared behind us, consumed by the smoke and distance. I felt nothing watching it go. It had been hell, but it had also been predictable, known. What lay ahead was worse precisely because I couldn't imagine it. My mind, stretched thin by months of systematic abuse, couldn't conjure scenarios brutal enough to match the reality I was driving toward. The front was 20 kilometers from the camp, though the journey took 3 hours through destroyed infrastructure and clogged supply routes. The landscape was lunar, cratered and lifeless, the earth churned into mud and ash by months of shelling. Burned-out vehicles littered the roadside, some imperial, some enemy, all equally dead. Bodies too, though mostly just pieces, a torso here, a limb there, organic debris that merged with the mud and became indistinguishable from it. The smell was extraordinary, even through the truck's exhaust fumes. Decay on a massive scale, rot and chemicals and smoke combining into an odor so thick it coated the back of your throat and made you gag with every breath. We dismounted at a forward staging area, a network of trenches and bunkers carved into the devastated earth. The noise here was constant, artillery fire from our positions and the enemy's, the crack of small arms, the scream of aircraft, the rumble of armor. The air vibrated with it, the sound waves hitting your chest and making your internal organs quiver. Soldiers moved through the trenches with the jerky precision of people operating on adrenaline and sleep deprivation. They barely glanced at us as we filed past. We were replacements, fresh meat to fill positions left vacant by yesterday's dead. Our arrival was routine, unremarkable. A sergeant assembled us in a communications trench and delivered our assignment with the enthusiasm of someone reading a supply manifest. We were to reinforce a position-designated trench. 17 Echo, currently held by the remains of a regular guard infantry platoon. Our role was to provide additional bodies for an expected enemy assault, anticipated within the next 6 to 12 hours. Rules of engagement were simple: shoot anything that came over the parapet, hold the position until ordered to retreat, do not break under any circumstances. Breaking meant execution. Running meant execution. Showing cowardice meant execution. The commissars attached to our unit had full authority to maintain discipline through immediate and terminal means. Any questions? There were none. What would we ask? How to not die? They didn't know either. We were all just following orders, moving through the prescribed motions until something killed us or the war ended. The war would outlast us. That much was certain. Trench 17 Echo was a slit in the earth 3 meters deep and half that wide, the walls reinforced with sandbags and corrugated metal sheeting. It stretched for 100 meters before connecting to other trenches in a labyrinthine network that made no sense to us but presumably had tactical logic to someone. The guard platoon we were reinforcing had been reduced to 15 effectives from an original 40. They looked at us with hollow eyes, too tired to be resentful, too numb to care that we were Penal Legion scum. They showed us the firing steps, the ammunition caches, the designated fallback positions. They told us about the enemy, cultists mostly, with some mutant auxiliaries and occasionally something worse, something that required heavy weapons and prayers. They told us about the last assault 3 days ago, when the enemy had nearly breached the trench and they'd held only by calling artillery down on their own position. 20 men had died in that bombardment, ours and theirs mixed together. The sergeant telling us this was maybe 25 years old, but his eyes were ancient, millennia old, carrying weight that bent him forward even when he stood. We took up positions along the firing line, spacing ourselves according to the sergeant's directions. I found myself between 2 other Penal Legion troops, a woman convicted of sedition, her red stripe vivid against her pale forehead, and a man whose crime I never learned, his face a mask of scar tissue from old burns. Neither spoke. We crouched on the firing step, our lasguns resting on the parapet, and waited. The afternoon stretched. The artillery continued its irregular percussion. Somewhere down the trench line, someone was singing, a hymn maybe, the words lost in the ambient noise. I checked my weapon for the 100th time, ensuring the power pack was seated properly, that the sighting mechanism worked, that my fingers could find the trigger even if my mind retreated. Busy work, superstition, small rituals to impose order on chaos. The attack came at dusk when the light was failing and shadows pooled in every crater and depression. It began with their artillery, a sudden escalation that walked explosions down the trench line in sequence. The first rounds landed 30 meters to my left, throwing earth and bodies into the air. The concussion hit like a physical blow, making my ears ring and my vision swim. Then the next rounds, and the next, each one closer. I pressed myself against the trench wall and prayed to an emperor I wasn't sure existed, prayed to survive the next second, the next breath. Around me people were screaming, but I couldn't hear them, couldn't hear anything except the overwhelming roar of detonations. The bombardment lasted 5 minutes, maybe less. Time became elastic under that weight, seconds stretching and compressing. When it stopped, the sudden relative silence was disorienting. My ears rang with a high-pitched whine. Blood ran from my nose, though I couldn't remember being hit. I crawled back to the firing step and looked over the parapet. The no-man's land between our trench and the enemy's was filling with figures, hundreds of them, shambling and running and crawling toward our position. They were screaming too, but their screams were different, exultant and enraged, fueled by something other than fear. The order to fire came from somewhere, someone's voice cutting through the noise. We opened up with our lasguns, the last bolts creating a strobing effect in the dim light. The enemy came on through our fire, individuals falling but the mass continuing, unstoppable momentum. I fired methodically, choosing targets, squeezing the trigger, acquiring new targets, a rhythm that bypassed thought. The woman beside me was weeping as she fired, tears cutting channels through the dirt on her face. The burned man was silent, his scarred face immobile, his lasgun kicking against his shoulder in steady repetition. They reached our wire, razor wire, and concertina obstacles that we'd strung during the afternoon, following the guard sergeant's instructions. Some of the enemy became tangled, their momentum carrying them into the cutting edges, their bodies slicing open as they struggled. Others found gaps or threw themselves over the wire, using their own bodies as bridges for those behind. We shot them as they came, point blank now. The range reduced to meters. The lasgun's heat indicator climbed into the red. My hands were burned from touching the barrel shroud, but I couldn't stop, couldn't pause. They were in the trench. Someone on my right was screaming, the sound cutting off abruptly. I turned and saw the enemy, a man in tattered clothing, his face obscured by a crude mask, a crude blade in his hand, blood on his arms to the elbows. He saw me, charged. I got my lasgun up and fired from the hip, the shot taking him in the chest and dropping him in a heap. Then another was there, and another, and the trench became a seething mass of bodies fighting in the semi-dark. No room for shooting, just crude wrestling and stabbing and gouging. I lost my lasgun, or it was torn from my hands, I don't remember. I had a knife. From my webbing standard issue, 10 centimeters of sharpened steel, I used it, stabbed wildly at anything that moved wrong, at any shape that resolved into enemy rather than ally. The knife went in and came out slick. Someone's hands were around my throat. I couldn't breathe. My vision narrowed to a tunnel. I stabbed upward, felt the blade go through something soft. The hands released. I gasped, drawing air thick with smoke and blood scent. The commissar saved us or killed us, depending on your perspective. He appeared in the chaos with his bolt pistol and his sword, his black coat somehow unstained despite the carnage. He killed the enemy with mechanical precision, each bolt a kill, each sword stroke severing limbs or heads. His presence rallied us, or perhaps shamed us, into renewed effort. We pushed back, slowly, meter by meter, until the enemy broke and retreated back toward their lines. We shot them as they ran, our lasguns barking in the darkness. Some of them made it. Most didn't. The aftermath was worse than the fighting. We counted our dead and found that 40% of our unit was gone, killed in 15 minutes of close combat. The wounded outnumbered the dead, their screams filling the trench as the Medicae servitors moved among them with their cutting tools and stitch guns, saving those who could be saved, ending those who couldn't. I watched them work with disconnected fascination. The efficiency was remarkable. Triage, treatment, or termination, each casualty assessed and processed in seconds. I had survived. This realization came slowly, my mind struggling to accept it. I had survived, but I couldn't explain why. No skill, no courage, just blind chance, and the statistical reality that not everyone could die at once. The woman who'd been crying while shooting was dead. Her body sprawled at the bottom of the trench, her throat open to the spine. The burned man had survived, though his left arm hung useless, broken by a club or rifle butt. He sat against the trench wall and stared at nothing, his face still expressionless despite the injury. They didn't let us rest. The sergeant, a different one, the previous one having died during the bombardment, ordered us to clean the trench, to throw the bodies over the parapet, enemy and ally both, to restring the wire, to prepare for the next attack. We worked through the night, exhausted, moving on pure automation. My hands shook uncontrollably. My legs would barely support my weight. I worked anyway, following orders, because following orders was simpler than thinking. The next attack came 30 hours later, then another 12 hours after that, then another. They blurred together, separate incidents merging into a continuous experience of violence and terror. We learned to function in that state, to operate despite the fear, to kill when required and endure when possible. The Penal Legion troops fell in steady attrition, and new ones arrived to replace them, fresh striped convicts with wide eyes that would narrow and deaden within days or hours depending on the intensity of combat. I stopped learning names, stopped trying to form connections. Everyone was already dead, their bodies just didn't know it yet. I was wounded during the 9th attack, or maybe the 10th. A piece of shrapnel from a grenade, a jagged bit of metal that embedded itself in my shoulder and refused to come out. The Medicae servitor dug for it with instruments, gave up, and simply closed the wound around it. The metal is still there, a hard lump beneath the scar tissue, aching when atmospheric pressure changes. It's become a sort of weather predictor, that ache, a useful trait in the unpredictable climate of this world. The routine of combat became almost bearable through familiarity. Not comfortable, never comfortable, but predictable in its horror. You learned what to expect, how to maximize your chances of survival, which corners to cut in maintenance and preparation without compromising function. You learned to sleep through artillery fire, to eat while dead men lay feet away, to distinguish between the sounds of incoming and outgoing rounds. You became efficient at killing, the motions smooth and automatic, divorced from moral consideration. The enemy were targets, problems to solve with lasgun fire or grenades or, when necessary, bayonet and knife. They died and you continued, and that was the nature of things. 3 months into my deployment, they rotated us off the line for a week. Not leave, not rest in any meaningful sense, just a temporary removal to the rear areas where the immediate danger was reduced. We were housed in a transit barracks, a long structure of corrugated metal with bunks and minimal amenities. The lighting was better than the trenches, and the food was marginally more varied, but the respite felt wrong, dislocating. In the trenches, your purpose was clear: kill the enemy, hold the line, survive the next attack. Here there was nothing but waiting, and waiting gave you time to think, and thinking was corrosive. I found myself remembering details I'd thought lost. The smell of my daughter's hair after bathing, a clean scent like synthetic soap and child sweat. The way my wife would hum while working, unconscious melodies that filled our HAB unit with something approaching comfort. These memories arrived unwanted, intrusive, bringing pain that felt more real than the physical wounds. I tried to suppress them, to push them back down, but they persisted, rising at night when sleep wouldn't come, coloring my thoughts with loss and impossible longing. Others handled the respite worse. Fights broke out over nothing, a perceived slight, a borrowed item, accumulated resentments erupting into violence. The commissars executed 2 men for attacking a sergeant, making us watch as they'd made us watch everything, reinforcing the only lesson that mattered: obey or die. Some men broke psychologically, curling up in their bunks and refusing to move, refusing to speak, retreating so far inward they might never return. The medica servitors collected them and took them away. We never asked where. We were sent back to the front after 6 days, the 7th day of rest cancelled due to tactical necessity. The enemy was massing for a major offensive, intelligence suggested, and every available unit was needed on the line. We loaded into the trucks with the same dead-eyed compliance we'd shown arriving months ago. The transport dropped us at a different sector this time, a position designated Trench 22 Alpha, where the fighting had been particularly intense and casualty rates particularly high. The ground here was saturated with blood, the earth a dark red-brown that squelched underfoot. The smell was indescribable. Previous descriptions feel inadequate. This was decay elevated to environmental condition, a miasma so thick it felt solid, clogging your airways and coating your lungs. The offensive came 2 days later, a coordinated assault across multiple sectors. The enemy threw everything at us: infantry in waves, supporting armor, even some kind of aircraft that shrieked overhead and strafed our positions with heavy weapons. Our artillery responded, and the enemy's, and the sky filled with smoke and las fire and tracer rounds drawing bright lines through the darkness. I fired until my lasgun's power pack depleted, reloaded, fired until that pack depleted, reloaded again. Targets everywhere. The enemy in their masks and tattered uniforms, screaming their devotion to their false gods, dying in heaps on our wire and in our trenches. We killed them, and they kept coming. And we killed them, and they kept coming. An endless supply of bodies throwing themselves at our position. The line broke during the 2nd day of fighting. Not our section, somewhere to the south. A catastrophic breach that let enemy forces flood into our rear areas. The order came to retreat, to fall back to secondary defensive positions, but the retreat was chaos, units fragmenting and scattering, command and control collapsing under the weight of too many casualties and too much confusion. I followed the man in front of me, who followed someone else, and we ran through communication trenches and across open ground, las fire chasing us, explosions throwing dirt and bodies into the air. Half the people running with me at the start were gone by the time we reached something resembling a defensive line. Whether dead or separated I didn't know and couldn't afford to care. The secondary position was a hastily prepared earthwork, barely more than a ditch, but we filled it and turned and fired at the pursuing enemy. The fighting here was worse than the prepared trenches. No overhead cover, no proper fields of fire, just desperate close-range shooting as they charged up the slight rise toward our position. A grenade landed beside me, live and spinning. I grabbed it and threw it back in one motion, pure reflex without thought. It detonated among the attackers, the blast wave washing over me. Someone was laughing. I realized it was me, high-pitched and unhinged, a sound disconnected from any actual emotion. I stopped laughing and resumed firing. We held the secondary position for 3 hours before reinforcements arrived, regular guard infantry with armor support, real soldiers with proper equipment and unit cohesion. They took over the line and pushed the enemy back, their armor grinding forward over the bodies, their organized fire teams executing proper tactical maneuvers. We were pulled back again, this time to a rest area, though calling it rest was generous. We sat in a muddy field and tried to process what had happened, tried to account for who remained. Our unit of 200 had been reduced to 47 effectives. The rest were dead, wounded, missing, or scattered. The commissar who'd been attached to us was gone, last seen during the retreat, his fate unknown. No one mourned him. They reconstituted our unit. With fresh bodies from the Penal Legion pipeline, new convicts with red-striped foreheads and terrified eyes. I looked at them and saw myself months ago, saw the same incomprehension and denial. They would learn, or they would die before learning. Either way, the machine would continue processing bodies through the meat grinder of imperial warfare, extracting every possible measure of utility before disposal. I was promoted, if you could call it that. The sergeant in charge of our section had died during the offensive, and someone needed to fill the role. The choice fell to me based on seniority. I'd survived longer than anyone else in the unit, a dubious achievement that carried no reward except additional responsibility. They gave me a sergeant's insignia, a small piece of painted metal to pin to my collar, and told me I was now responsible for coordinating the 23 men in my section. No additional training, no guidance beyond what I'd absorbed through observation, just the expectation that I would lead, that I would make decisions that would send men to their deaths, that I would maintain discipline and execute orders regardless of personal cost. The first man I ordered to his death was a kid named Joran, convicted of desertion from a factory guard unit. He was 18, maybe 19, with hands that still shook when he loaded his lasgun. I sent him forward as a scout during a patrol, knowing the enemy had snipers covering that approach, knowing he would likely die but needing the information his death would provide. He made it 15 meters before the last bolt took him in the head. I noted the sniper's position, called in the coordinates, and ordered the patrol to proceed along a different route. This was leadership in the Penal Legions, calculated sacrifice, acceptable losses, the arithmetic of survival. Time continued its strange, elastic behavior. Days compressed into indistinct sequences of watch duty and combat, while individual moments, the particular way a last bolt looked punching through someone's chest, the sound a dying man made as his lungs filled with blood, the smell of burning flesh from a flamer strike, stretched and expanded until they occupied more psychological space than entire weeks. I stopped counting days. The administrative clerks would track my service time, would log each combat action and survival, would eventually determine whether I'd served enough to earn redemption or needed to continue until death resolved the question. My role was simpler: follow orders, lead my section, kill the enemy, survive. The war ground on through seasons I couldn't distinguish, except by subtle changes in the misery. The mud froze during what might have been winter, making digging impossible but at least reducing the smell. Then it thawed and became a morass that swallowed equipment and bodies alike. Then it dried and cracked during a hot period, the dust choking and omnipresent. Then the rains came and turned everything back to mud. Through it all we fought, attacked, defended, retreated, advanced, the front line shifting back and forth over the same cratered ground, each side trading ownership of worthless real estate at the cost of thousands of lives. I stopped resembling the person I'd been. That transformation wasn't sudden, no single moment of change. just a gradual erosion of everything that had defined me before. The man who'd stolen to feed his family was gone. What remained was a thing that could lead patrols into killing zones, that could order men to hold positions until they died, that could kill with hands or guns or improvised weapons, that could witness horrors and process them as tactical information rather than human tragedy. I'd become functional within the system, optimized for my role, stripped of extraneous sentiment or doubt. My section regarded me with wary respect, the kind you give to anything dangerous and unpredictable. I wasn't cruel, had no energy for cruelty, but I wasn't kind either. I was efficient. I kept them alive when possible through sound tactical decisions. I spent their lives when necessary to accomplish objectives. They understood this calculus, recognized it as the only viable approach to Penal Legion existence. Some hated me for it, some were grateful. Most felt nothing, too exhausted and traumatized to sustain any emotional engagement. We were rotated to a new sector, after what the administratum clerks insisted was 6 months, though it felt simultaneously longer and shorter. This sector was different, urban ruins rather than open trenches, the fighting taking place through collapsed buildings and debris-choked streets. The enemy here were cultists of a particular variety, fanatics who'd turned against the Imperium after some grievance or revelation, now fighting with the desperation of people who knew they'd be purged whether they surrendered or not. They were better equipped than previous enemies we'd faced, with stolen guard equipment and some kind of off-world support providing heavy weapons. The fighting was brutal and intimate, room to room, sometimes hand to hand in tight spaces where lasguns were useless and you fought with knives and fists and teeth. I lost people constantly in those ruins. A collapsed ceiling would kill 3 men, a sniper would pick off stragglers, a booby trap would detonate and tear someone apart. We adapted, became more cautious, more suspicious of everything. We moved through the ruins like animals, senses heightened, expecting death around every corner. Sometimes death was there, sometimes it wasn't. You couldn't predict, could only react. The urban sector consumed 2 months before command declared it pacified, a term that meant we killed enough of the enemy that the remainder had gone to ground or retreated to other areas. Pacified didn't mean safe, just less immediately lethal. The ruins still claimed lives through unexploded ordnance and structural collapses and holdouts who'd hidden in cellars and emerged to attack isolated troops. But we moved on, reassigned to the next sector, the next objective, the next grinding campaign in an endless war. I'd been in the Penal Legion for 1 year and 4 months when I received the Commissar's notice, a formal document delivered by a servitor informing me that my service record had been reviewed and assessed. I'd survived 18 major engagements, commanded a section with acceptable casualty ratios, demonstrated leadership qualities sufficient for continued service in command capacity. I was hereby promoted to junior sergeant, with authority over a full platoon of Penal Legion troops. My sentence was reduced by 1/3 in recognition of meritorious service. I had 7 years, 2 months remaining before I could apply for redemption review. 7 years. The number meant nothing. I couldn't conceive of 7 years, couldn't imagine surviving another 7 weeks. The promotion was equally meaningless, more responsibility, more men to order into death, no additional resources or support, just a slightly larger number on the casualty reports I'd generate. I filed the document in my personal effects and continued following orders. The platoon I inherited was typical, a mixture of long-term survivors like myself and fresh convicts cycled in from the processing centers. 52 men, theoretically, though we rarely fielded more than 40 due to injuries, illness, and the steady attrition of combat. They looked at me with the same dead eyes I'd seen in every mirror, the same understanding that our collective fate was already sealed and we were just working through the remaining arithmetic. I gave them the same pragmatic leadership I'd given my section, clear orders, sound tactics when possible, efficient use of their lives when efficiency mattered more than preservation. Some lived longer because of it, all died eventually, including me, though I didn't know when. The war continued without regard for individual experience. Objectives changed, sectors rotated, Enemy designations varied, but the fundamental nature remained constant. Kill the enemy, hold the line, accept losses, repeat. The Imperium's war machine was vast and impersonal, and we were microscopic components within it, individual atoms in a mass so large that our presence or absence made no statistical difference. This should have been crushing knowledge. Instead, it was almost liberating. If nothing you did mattered, then the pressure of consequence evaporated. You simply existed, followed orders, performed your function. Meaning was for people with futures. We had only the present moment, and the moment was always the same. I learned to recognize the patterns of my own deterioration, the tremor in my hands that had started after the first month and gradually worsened. The way sounds sometimes became overwhelming, normal conversation volumes perceived as shouting, forcing me to retreat into silence. The intrusive thoughts that arrived during quiet moments, violent fantasies that felt more real than memory, scenarios of killing that played out with vivid intensity. I was developing what the old guard veterans called the 1,000-meter stare, a psychological condition where your eyes focused on something beyond the visible, where the present stopped registering and you existed in a perpetual state of anticipatory trauma. The Medicae officer I mentioned it to during a routine check shrugged and noted it in my file. He'd seen it countless times. There was no treatment. You either adapted or you broke completely and received the commissar's mercy. My platoon participated in a major offensive during what administrative documents called the campaign's second phase. We were part of a larger force tasked with taking an enemy stronghold, a fortified complex that had resisted previous assaults and now required overwhelming force to crack. The assault began with 3 days of artillery preparation, our guns pounding the objective until the earth itself seemed to scream. Then we went over the top, climbing from our trenches and advancing across open ground toward the enemy position. The no man's land was 400 meters of cratered wasteland. We crossed it at a run, losing people with every step to enemy fire. Las bolts and solid rounds filled the air, the sound a continuous roar punctuated by screams and detonations. I ran in a crouch, my lasgun clutched to my chest, my legs pumping mechanically. Around me people fell. I didn't stop. Stopping meant dying. You ran and hoped momentum would carry you across, would deliver you to the enemy position where at least you could find cover and fight back. I made it. Others made it. Many didn't. We hit their outer defenses and immediately engaged in close combat, the fighting savage and unstructured. The enemy position was a network of bunkers and trenches similar to our own, and we cleared it room by room, bunker by bunker, using grenades and flamers and point-blank lasgun fire. The flamers were particularly effective but also particularly horrible. The promethium streams incinerating everything they touched, the screams of burning men cutting through even the ambient battle noise. I tried not to watch, but sometimes you had to watch, had to witness to confirm the kill, to ensure no one was playing dead and waiting to attack from behind. We took the objective after 8 hours of continuous fighting. The cost was staggering. My platoon of 43 effectives reduced to 19. The other units involved suffered similar losses. We'd lost nearly 70% of the assault force to take a position of dubious tactical value, a stronghold that command would probably abandon within a week, as the front shifted again. But the assault was logged as a success, the objective marked captured on tactical maps, the casualty numbers filed away in reports that would be read by officers far from the front, who would nod and requisition replacement bodies to fill the depleted units. We held that position for 6 days before orders came to withdraw. The enemy had massed forces for a counterattack that our depleted strength couldn't repel. We retreated under fire, carrying our wounded, leaving our dead. The enemy retook the position within hours of our departure, all the lives spent to capture it, negated by simple tactical necessity. This should have enraged me, this futility and waste. Instead, I felt nothing. The assault had been orders, the retreat was orders. Neither required emotional investment. Fresh troops arrived to replenish our numbers, not just Penal Legion, but some regular guard infantry transferred to our command structure. either punishment for some unit-level failure or simply administrative convenience. The regular guard troops resented serving with Penal Legion scum, and the tension was immediate. They considered themselves superior, legitimate soldiers rather than convicts, and they made this clear through their behavior and comments. I didn't have energy for politics. I made it clear that within my platoon your background was irrelevant. You followed orders and performed your function or you died. Several of the regular guard troops challenged this, testing whether a Penal Legion sergeant could discipline real soldiers. I shot one who refused a direct order during combat. The commissar backed my decision. The challenges stopped. The integrated unit functioned adequately once the hierarchy was established through violence. The regular guard troops brought better training and discipline, while the Penal Legion troops brought the hard-earned experience of continuous combat and survival under impossible conditions. Together we were marginally more effective than either group alone, though effectiveness was always relative. We completed objectives, held positions, inflicted casualties. We also took casualties, the attrition steady and predictable. Names cycled through the roster like changing shifts, each one temporary, provisional, ultimately meaningless. 2 years. I'd been in the Penal Legion for 2 years when I received the second review notice. My sentence was further reduced based on continued meritorious service, 5 years remaining now rather than 7. I was promoted again to Sergeant First Class with authority over multiple platoons within a company structure. The promotion came with a small increase in rations and slightly better equipment, a las gun with a functioning sight mechanism, body armor that might actually stop a round, boots that fit properly. These material improvements made minimal difference to survival probability but demonstrated the Imperium's reward system: serve well and you receive marginally less suffering, though the ultimate outcome remains unchanged. I'd stopped thinking about redemption, about the theoretical end of sentence that would restore my civilian status and allow me to leave the Penal Legion. Such thinking was fantasy, disconnected from reality. No one left. You died, or you continued serving until you died. The administrative framework that suggested otherwise was psychological manipulation, a carrot dangled to maintain compliance. Some of the newer convicts still believed in it, still counted days and calculated their remaining time. I didn't disabuse them. The illusion served a purpose, kept them functional. Better to believe in false hope than acknowledge the truth. The war reached its 3rd year without any perceptible change in intensity or scope. We still fought over the same ground, still died in the same ways, still followed orders that ground us into paste for objectives we didn't understand. The enemy seemed inexhaustible, their forces constantly replenished from sources we never saw. Our forces were equally inexhaustible. The Imperium's population counted in the quadrillions, the machinery of conscription and conviction and compulsion, feeding a constant stream of bodies into the military apparatus. This particular war, on this particular world, was a minor event in the Imperium's vast accounting, barely worthy of note in the historical records. We who fought it were less than minor, less than noteworthy, just numbers in a ledger, statistics in a report. I developed a reputation during that 3rd year. The other sergeants began deferring to my judgment on tactical matters, recognizing something in my approach that worked, that kept casualty rates lower than average while still achieving objectives. It wasn't genius, just applied cynicism and willingness to ignore doctrine when reality demanded adaptation. The Guard operated on rigid procedures, techniques refined over millennia, and codified in training manuals and tactical primers. These procedures worked under certain conditions. Under other conditions, they got people killed uselessly. I ignored procedures when necessary, improvised solutions based on local terrain and enemy behavior. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But at least failure came from calculated risk rather than blind adherence to inappropriate doctrine. The commissar attached to our regiment noticed me during one of his inspection tours. He was a different commissar than the ones I'd previously encountered, older, with the weathered look of someone who'd served decades rather than years. He watched me coordinate a defensive position, observed how I deployed troops and established firing lines, noted my corrections to junior sergeants. Afterward, he called me to his command post and questioned me about my approach. I answered honestly, expecting execution for doctrinal deviation. Instead, he nodded and told me I'd be instructing other sergeants on practical combat leadership. This was not a reward, he clarified. This was duty, assigned because I'd demonstrated capability. I would continue my regular combat assignments while also conducting training sessions during rest periods. I acknowledged the order without comment. The training duty was peculiar. I stood before groups of sergeants, both Penal Legion and regular guard, and described techniques that violated a dozen doctrinal principles. I explained why massed assaults across open ground usually achieved nothing except casualties, why fighting withdrawal was often better than holding untenable positions, why wasting ammunition on suppressive fire could be more valuable than aimed shooting, why abandoning wounded was sometimes necessary for unit survival. The regular guard sergeants bristled at these suggestions, viewing them as cowardice or defeatism. The Penal Legion sergeants understood immediately, recognizing truths they'd learned through experience. The commissar attended every session, his hand never far from his bolt pistol, ready to execute me if I crossed from pragmatism into heresy. I never crossed that line. Everything I taught served the Emperor and the Imperium, just through unorthodox means. The rest periods between training sessions and combat assignments were the worst times. During combat, you were too busy to think, your mind occupied with immediate threats and tactical problems. During rest, thought returned, and thought was corrosive. I would lie in my bunk and feel the weight of everything I'd done, everyone I'd killed or ordered killed, pressing down like physical force. The dead were uncountable now, a number so large it had lost meaning, but their faces would appear in that space between waking and sleep, accusatory and silent. I never apologized to those faces. Apology would be meaningless, an indulgence. I'd done what was necessary. That necessity didn't absolve me, but it also didn't require justification. We were all trapped in the same machine, all following the same imperative of survival and duty. Some of us survived longer. That was the only distinction that mattered. 3 years, 4 years, the markers blurred together. Time had become something that happened to me rather than something I moved through. My body continued functioning despite accumulated damage, scars layering over scars, old injuries that never healed properly, chronic infections that antibiotics couldn't fully clear. I looked like a veteran now, moved like one, carried myself with the particular economy of motion that came from absolute exhaustion and rigid discipline. New convicts would look at me with something approaching awe, seeing a template of possible survival, not understanding that survival meant becoming something inhuman, something that could function in conditions that should break any reasonable person. My sentence reached the halfway point according to administrative records. I'd served 5 years, had 5 remaining before eligibility for redemption review. The commissar called me to his office and presented this information formally, as if it mattered, as if I cared. He told me my service record was exemplary, that I'd demonstrated exceptional leadership and combat effectiveness, that I was a credit to the Penal Legions and the Imperial Guard. He told me my redemption was virtually assured barring catastrophic failure or death. I thanked him for the information and requested permission to return to my duties. He granted permission, looking at me with an expression I couldn't interpret, possibly respect, possibly pity, possibly the recognition of shared understanding that all of this was theater and we were both just following scripts. The war entered its 5th year. The front had moved 40 kilometers from where I'd first deployed, though whether this represented advance or retreat, I couldn't determine. The strategic situation was above my grade, irrelevant to my function. I commanded a company now, promoted again through attrition and competence, responsible for 200 troops spread across 4 platoons. The company was a mixture of Penal Legion and regular guard, the distinction increasingly meaningless as service blended everyone into the same exhausted, traumatized mass. We fought when ordered, rested when permitted, died. According to actuarial tables that predicted our extinction with statistical precision. The enemy changed during the 5th year. New forces appeared on the battlefield, no longer just cultists and mutants, but something worse, something that made the commissars nervous and the priests invoke protective prayers. I never saw them clearly, just impressions of movement and overwhelming violence, entities that didn't behave according to natural law. Our lasguns worked against them, but inefficiently, requiring sustained fire to achieve kills. They would appear suddenly, slaughter a squad or platoon, then disappear as if they'd never existed. Command responded with increased ecclesiarchy presence, priests embedded with combat units, conducting constant prayer services and warding rituals, anointing weapons with blessed oils, and consecrating positions with holy water. Whether this helped, I couldn't determine. People kept dying. The rituals provided psychological comfort, a sense of agency in the face of incomprehensible threat. That had value, even if the protective benefits were questionable. I developed a habit of writing during this period. Not a journal, that was forbidden, potential sedition or intelligence breach. Just fragments, observations, single sentences scratched onto whatever scrap material I could find and then destroyed. The act of writing provided a release valve, a way to externalize thoughts that would otherwise fester. I would write a sentence describing something I'd witnessed, read it once, then burn it or bury it. The sentence existed briefly, acknowledged reality briefly, then disappeared. This felt appropriate. Everything disappeared eventually. Might as well practice. The 6th year brought a change in command structure. Our regiment was attached to a larger offensive operation, integrated into a combined arms force that included armor and artillery support. We were to assault a major enemy strongpoint, a fortress complex that had anchored their defensive line for years. The operation had been in planning for months, with detailed reconnaissance and tactical preparation. We would have close air support, preliminary bombardment, follow-on logistics. This was a proper military operation rather than the usual grinding attrition. The briefings were extensive, the expectations high. We were told this assault would break the enemy's will, that success here would precipitate collapse across the entire front. I'd heard similar claims before. They were never true. But orders were orders, and I prepared my company for the assault with the same methodical attention I'd given every previous operation. The assault began well. The bombardment was spectacular. Days of sustained artillery fire that reduced the enemy strongpoint to rubble. Then the armor went forward, grinding through the outer defenses, creating breaches that infantry could exploit. We followed the armor, moving through the breaches in organized formations, the operation proceeding according to plan. For 6 hours, everything worked. We penetrated deep into the enemy complex, secured key objectives, established defensive positions. Command was jubilant, declaring success ahead of schedule. Then everything collapsed. The enemy counterattacked, with forces they'd kept hidden, emerging from subterranean passages and striking our flanks and rear simultaneously. The armor was cut off, surrounded and destroyed. The infantry units fragmented, losing cohesion as the battle devolved into disconnected fights across the ruined complex. My company held our assigned sector, beating back repeated assaults, but we were isolated, cut off from support or reinforcement. The Vox network became chaos, contradictory orders and distress calls, and finally silence, as units were overrun or withdrew without authorization. We held for 3 days, 72 hours of continuous combat in a ruined bunker complex, fighting off attackers while rationing ammunition and watching our casualty count climb. We ate corpses toward the end, enemy corpses, the only food available, cooking them over fires made from burning debris. This was necessary. The body required calories to function. The source of those calories was irrelevant. Some of the troops couldn't do it, their conditioning too strong. They weakened and died. The rest of us ate and survived. I didn't think about what I was eating, didn't allow psychological space for horror or revulsion. It was protein. We needed protein. Moral considerations were luxuries we couldn't afford. The relief force broke through on the 4th day. Regular guard infantry, with fresh supplies and ammunition, pushing through enemy lines to extract survivors. Of my company of 243 remained alive. Some were wounded, some were mad, All were beyond exhaustion. They loaded us onto transports and evacuated us from the complex, which the enemy retook within hours. Another futile operation, another massive expenditure of lives for no lasting gain. The after-action reports would classify it as a partial success, objectives achieved even if not held, and move on to planning the next operation. I spent 2 weeks in a Medicae facility recovering from wounds I didn't remember receiving. The Medicae servitors patched and stitched and injected, returning me to minimal functionality. Other patients in the facility were far worse. Men with missing limbs, burned faces, psychological breaks so severe they couldn't speak or recognize their surroundings. I was mobile, coherent, capable of holding a weapon. Therefore I was fit for duty and discharged back to my unit, such as it existed. The company had been reconstituted with fresh bodies while I was hospitalized. Another 200 troops designated to replace the 157 who died in the Strongpoint assault. I resumed command and continued following orders. 7 years, 8 years. The numbers clicked over in administrative records while I continued fighting. My body was failing incrementally, each system degrading under the accumulated strain. My vision had deteriorated, requiring corrective lenses that I rarely had access to. My hearing was damaged, high-frequency tinnitus constant and maddening. My lungs were scarred from smoke and chemical exposure, limiting my endurance. My digestive system was compromised, unable to properly process the military rations. My hands shook constantly now, the tremor pronounced enough that it affected my shooting accuracy. I was falling apart, but slowly, the degradation measured in years rather than days. Slowly enough that I could still function, could still lead and fight and follow orders. The redemption review came after 8 years and 4 months, ahead of schedule due to what the commissar called exceptional service in extended high-intensity combat operations. They conducted the review at regimental headquarters, a formal proceeding with multiple officers and ecclesiarchy representatives. They reviewed my record, the combat actions, the leadership evaluations, the disciplinary notes, the promotion history. They asked me questions about my faith, about my loyalty to the Emperor, about my understanding of my crimes and rehabilitation. I answered mechanically, saying what they wanted to hear because I understood the script. They deliberated for 4 hours, then returned with their decision: sentence commuted, conviction pardoned, full restoration of civilian status, pending completion of transition protocols. I felt nothing. The redemption I'd supposedly earned meant nothing. There was no civilian life to return to. My family was 8 years gone, my previous existence erased. I'd been informed of my wife's death 3 years ago, a terse notification via administrative channels. Factory accident. My daughter's fate was unspecified, presumably consigned to state care institutions. I had no home, no identity outside the military, no skills except violence and endurance. The officers congratulated me, the priests blessed me, and I signed documents acknowledging my release from penal service. They transferred me to a veterans rehabilitation facility, a grim institutional space where former soldiers were supposedly prepared for reintegration into civilian life. The facility was understaffed and underfunded, the rehabilitation consisting mostly of waiting. We attended occasional classes on civilian employment, on proper behavior in non-military contexts, on managing psychological trauma. The classes were perfunctory, taught by disinterested instructors to audiences who weren't listening. Most of the veterans at the facility were as damaged as I was, some worse. We existed in parallel, occupying the same spaces without truly interacting, each isolated in our own aftermath. I lasted 4 weeks in the rehabilitation facility before I requested return to military service. The request went through administrative review, then medical evaluation, then psychological assessment. They determined I was fit for continued service, if not frontline combat. They offered me a training position instructing new guard recruits in practical combat techniques. I accepted. What else would I do? Civilian life was a foreign country whose language I no longer spoke. The military was the only environment that made sense, the only place where my accumulated experience had value. They assigned me to a training facility on a different world, far from the front lines but still within the vast machinery of imperial warfare. I taught classes of fresh recruits, boys and girls barely old enough to hold a lasgun, trying to compress years of hard-learned lessons into weeks of instruction. I taught them how to dig proper fighting positions, how to maintain their weapons in field conditions, how to move under fire. I taught them the unofficial knowledge that doctrine omitted, how to identify which orders would get them killed pointlessly, how to maximize survival probability. Without crossing into cowardice, how to function when everything went wrong. Some listened, some ignored me, confident in their training and doctrine. Those who listened might survive their first combat. Those who didn't would learn or die. The teaching position was supposed to be easier, safer. In some ways it was. No one was actively trying to kill me. I slept in a real bed, ate adequate food, had access to Medicaid care. But the psychological toll was worse than combat. During combat, you were too busy to process. Here, there was nothing but time to process, to remember, to confront everything you'd survived and everything you'd done. The memories arrived with increasing frequency and intensity, not as narrative recollection, but as sensory flashbacks that made the past indistinguishable from present. I would be conducting a class and suddenly smell burning flesh, see lust bolts in my peripheral vision, hear screaming that wasn't there. I would function through these episodes, continuing the lesson while part of my mind existed in some previous battlefield. The recruits never knew. I became expert at maintaining external composure while internally fragmenting. The Medicaid officer at the training facility diagnosed me with acute stress reaction, chronic post-traumatic syndrome, complex anxiety disorder, and several other conditions with long technical names. The diagnosis changed nothing. There was no treatment except time, and time didn't heal so much as build scar tissue over wounds that remained fundamentally open. They prescribed medication, small pills that were supposed to regulate brain chemistry, restore proper function. The pills made everything distant and muffled, wrapping reality in insulation that reduced both pain and engagement. I took them as prescribed for 2 months, then stopped. Better to feel everything than feel nothing. The memories were mine, earned through experience, and suppressing them felt like betrayal of the dead whose faces I carried. I taught at the facility for 2 years. Thousands of recruits cycled through, each class a fresh group of faces that would blur together in memory. Some would die in their first engagement. Some would survive and become veterans like me, carrying their own catalogues of trauma and loss. I prepared them as best I could, knowing preparation was inadequate against reality's weight. The Imperium's wars would consume them as they'd consumed me, grinding them down until nothing remained except the function of fighting and dying. This was the nature of service. This was the price of humanity's survival in a hostile galaxy. I didn't question it anymore. Questions required energy I didn't have. The facility received a priority requisition during my 3rd year there. Experienced combat instructors needed for a Penal Legion training program, preference for candidates with prior penal service. The assignment was voluntary, but voluntary in the military sense where refusal was theoretically possible, but practically discouraged. I volunteered. The request felt inevitable, a gravity well I'd been orbiting since my redemption. I couldn't escape the Penal Legions. They were my context, my element, the environment where I understood the rules. They sent me back to Tertius-17, back to the same processing facilities where I'd been prepared for combat 9 years ago. The war was still grinding on, unchanged in nature if not specific details. The enemy had evolved, the front lines had shifted, but the fundamental equation remained. Bodies fed into the machine, casualties extracted, new bodies fed in. I was now part of the input process, preparing convicts for their transformation into expendable soldiers. The symmetry felt appropriate. I'd been processed, now I processed others. The cycle was complete. I trained Penal Legion troops with brutal honesty, not softening reality or offering false hope. I told them they were going to die, that redemption was statistical fantasy, that their only choice was how they died, quickly and pointlessly, or after extracting some measure of utility from their remaining time. I taught them to shoot, to dig, to follow orders, to suppress natural self-preservation instincts when tactical necessity required. I taught them to become what I'd become, functional automatons capable of enduring the unendurable. The commissar supervising the training program called me to his office after 3 months. He told me my methods were producing results. Lower initial casualty rates, better unit cohesion, improved combat effectiveness. He told me I was being promoted to senior instructor with authority over the entire training program. He told me I was serving the Emperor well, that my redemption had purpose and meaning. I accepted the promotion and thanked him for the recognition. His words were hollow, devoid of content, but I understood he was following his own script, just as I followed mine. We were all performing roles in a vast bureaucratic theater. I've been training Penal Legion troops for 4 years now, 13 years since I falsified those cargo manifests, since enforcers took me from my life and processed me into this system. I'm 43 years old according to birth records, though I feel ancient, millennia old, carrying weight that should be distributed across generations. My body is failing comprehensively, the wounds and injuries and accumulated stress manifesting as systemic breakdown. The Medicae officers tell me I have maybe 5 years of functional capacity remaining, maybe less. They offer augmentation, mechanical replacement of failing organs and limbs, the option of continuing as something part human and part machine. I've declined so far. When my body stops functioning, I'll be done. No artificial extension, no mechanical afterlife, just the natural conclusion. I think about my daughter sometimes, though the memories are fragmentary and suspect. She'd be 21 now, an adult, if she survived the state care. Institutions, I'll never know. The Imperium doesn't maintain records that would allow me to trace her, and even if it did, what would I say? I'm the father who abandoned her, who chose theft over lawful suffering, whose absence shaped her entire life. Better that she thinks me dead, better that she never knows what I became. The red stripe on my forehead has faded over the years, the tattoo ink breaking down gradually, but it's still visible under close examination. A permanent mark of who I was, what I did, where I belonged. They could remove it now. I'm no longer Penal Legion, no longer a convict, but I've kept it. Seems dishonest to erase it, to pretend the past didn't happen. I was marked. I remain marked. The stripe is the truth of me, more accurate than any redemption certificate or discharge papers. I'll die here, on Tertius 17 or some similar world, training convicts for wars that never end. This seems fitting. I was processed by the system and became part of the system, another component in the machinery of imperial warfare. My individual existence matters not at all. I'm replaceable, fungible, one instructor among thousands performing the same function. When I stop functioning, another instructor will take my place, will deliver the same lessons to the same desperate faces, will contribute to the same endless consumption of human life in service of humanity's survival. This is my redemption, not freedom or restoration, but understanding. I understand what I am, what we all are. Expendable resources managed by vast bureaucratic machinery, our suffering and death logged in ledgers and processed through administrative channels, ultimately forgotten. We exist briefly, serve our function, and disappear. The Imperium continues, indifferent to individual fate, concerned only with aggregate utility. This should be horrifying. Instead, it's almost comforting. The burden of meaning is lifted when you accept meaninglessness. You simply exist, perform your function, and eventually cease. Simple, clean, true. I tell the convicts in my training cohorts that the miserable life of a Penal Legion recruit is simultaneously the worst thing they'll experience and the most honest. The Imperium strips away all pretense, all comfortable lies about individual value or divine purpose. You're material to be consumed. Accept this and you can function. Resist and you'll break. Most resist initially, most break eventually. The few who accept early are the ones who survive longest, who extract some measure of utility from their remaining time. I was one of those. I accepted. I survived. And survival brought me here, to this place, this role, this moment of reflection. The war continues beyond these walls. The training continues within them. I continue, diminished and damaged, performing my function until biology fails. This is the miserable life I earned through my choices, transformed by the Imperium's machinery into something useful. I don't regret the theft that started this chain of events. My daughter's health was worth it. I don't celebrate my survival or redemption. They're administrative categories, not achievements. I simply exist in the present, doing what's required, waiting for the inevitable end. We all are. Waiting, functioning, fading. This is the only truth that matters, the only lesson worth teaching. We are all already dead. Our bodies just haven't processed the information yet. Accept this and you'll understand everything. The red stripe on my forehead is fading, but I remember what it means, what it always meant, what it will mean when the system finally finishes consuming me and moves on to the next marked soul.